Friends, today let's talk about the confrontation between the Federal Reserve and the White House. Trump isn't introducing heavyweight policies that shock the market every few days, but his conflict with the Fed presents a significant risk that the market seriously underestimates. If not handled properly, it won't be a black swan event. It's very likely to turn into a financial nuclear bomb. Let's lighten the mood by discussing the verbal war between Trump and Powell. Honestly, Trump's trash talking is undeniable. He's been ranting relentlessly for months without stopping. From day one, he criticized the Federal Reserve, urging immediate rate cuts and accusing Powell of delays, while noting Europe's 7 consecutive rate reductions. Why are you, stubborn old man, only cutting rates halfway and not stopping? Of course, I labeled him stubborn old man. The reports are always lenient. We must rely on data and remain data dependent. Moving on to April, Trump seems to have entered a buying frenzy mode. Every year on March 7th, it's like something big happens every week. The main point to consider is that if you intend to dismiss Powell from his current role, the President of the United States does not hold the requisite authority to undertake such an important action. You probably thought the war was escalating, but the next day Trump softened, saying, "I have no intention to remove Powell. You must have misheard me." He nicknamed Powell Too Late Paul and Mr. Too Late, labeling him a late, clueless student who doesn't understand. The core conflict between both sides is Trump wants Powell to cut interest rates quickly. It's a minor issue with clear logic. As analyzed earlier, the U.S. government's most important priority right now is to alleviate fiscal pressure, and the top priority is to reduce the government's borrowing costs, which means lowering interest rates. Another main goal is a weaker dollar to ease manufacturing offshoring pressures. Both goals require lowering interest rates, which is the White House's main demand. To get Powell to cooperate with Trump, Treasury Secretary Bessemer is going every week to have breakfast with Powell, persistently negotiating. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve's core goal is yo-yo television series exclusive. Last year, U.S. inflation stayed below 3%, and the Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 100 basis points. However, this year, uncertainty surrounds Trump's policies. Powell paused talks this year, citing tariffs likely to reignite inflation, and said, "I need to take another look. I need clear data proving prices have cooled before cutting interest rates," making demands from both sides simple and clear. Trump's excessive abundance has led to aggressive criticism of Powell. Today, we'll examine the relationship between the Federal Reserve, U.S. government, Treasury, and White House. Don't ever think Trump is an exception. Historically, the Federal Reserve and U.S. presidents behave similarly. They rank among the world's most powerful, maintaining a delicate relationship, not mutually independent nor secretly collaborating. To deeply understand the love-hate relationship and the logic between the Federal Reserve and the White House, the best way is to quickly look at the Federal Reserve's development over the past century. Own battle for independence and then analyze how Trump might govern now. Let me tell you, it's very interesting. Without further ado, let's begin. In 1913, the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating the Federal Reserve, a key bank with 12 regions. Although the law granted independent monetary policy execution, in reality it was theoretical, and early policies had to align with Treasury needs. Overall, if independence were rated out of 10, I'd give it 5, which is even failing. And soon the Federal Reserve faced its first battle, the Gold War of the 1930s. When the Federal Reserve was established, the U.S. remained on the gold standard, requiring each issued dollar to be 40% gold-backed. The Federal Reserve functions as a supreme gold merchant, issuing money in proportion to its gold. Although the gold standard sounds very reasonable and strictly limits the money supply, there is a very serious problem with it. It forces the Federal Reserve to tighten more during depressions, thereby exacerbating the extent of economic fluctuations. During the 1929 depression, mass bank gold exchanges caused the Fed's reserves to drop from 4.5B to 3.2B. The Fed's constrained ability to issue currency limited stimulus during the crisis peak, forcing tightening. Consequently, President Roosevelt at the White House took the initiative. In 1934, the Gold Reserve Act abandoned the gold standard, nationalized gold, and required all citizens to surrender their gold. The key is that it targeted not the Federal Reserve, but the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and it required the Federal Reserve to transfer the vast majority of its gold to the Treasury. Once this move was made, it almost entirely revoked the Federal Reserve's functions concerning gold, while the Treasury effectively dictated the Fed's discount rate for monetary policy. Prioritizing government bond issuance hollowed out the Federal Reserve, causing the chairman to facetiously claim he didn't see himself as its nominal head. In reality, he felt like he was just assisting the Treasury Department, doing some very basic administrative work. After World War II began, the Federal Reserve lost independence to support the war effort. The Treasury followed agreements requiring the Fed to maintain very low interest rates. Purchasing government bonds below 2.5% helps Treasury finance, while the Federal Reserve remained an independent central bank. In reality, it was merely an arm of the Treasury. In the battle for control, the Federal Reserve's independence was rated 2 out of 5. After World War II, the Federal Reserve was to remain independent without undermining the Treasury, but the U.S. initiated the Korean War. The government needed money. President Truman maintained the Federal Reserve's bond-buying approach. The Federal Reserve stood firm. After all, prior excessive money printing caused U.S. inflation to exceed 9%. Continuing like this would harm the economy, so they denied Truman's request. After several difficult negotiations, the Treasury Secretary, a friend of Truman's, tricked the Federal Reserve by not communicating. In January 1951, his public speech announced the Fed's approval of the Treasury's bond plan, causing the Fed chairman anxiety. The agreement intensified conflict as the Federal Reserve remained legally independent with capital. He stated, "If your Treasury maintains such a hardline attitude." Subsequently, our policies will be independently decided without negotiation after a month of intense public conflict. Finally, Treasury made concessions and Federal Reserve signed the deal. In the 1951 monetary agreement, the Treasury let the Fed ignore fixed bond rates while the market saw its independence. Started with this 1951 agreement, with the Federal Reserve winning an independence rating of 6 points. Due to negotiation costs, the Federal Reserve chairman resigned, and William Ma, a Treasury Assistant Secretary for Negotiations, succeeded him. Martin, remember this important name. The Treasury Department initially supported placing someone in the Federal Reserve. Even if I signed the agreement, policies could align, but they didn't anticipate the so-called insider they placed in the Federal Reserve. As founding father of the Fed's independence, he served nearly 20 years as its longest chairman. A Fed building is named after him. Let me speak about Martin. His resume clearly shows he is very smart. He graduated from Yale and began his first job at a brokerage firm. After 2 years, he became a partner and at 29 joined the NYSE board. At 31, he became the president of the New York Stock Exchange, known as a Wall Street prodigy. During World War II, he enlisted and became a colonel. After World War II, he joined the Treasury Department and became the Treasury's Assistant Secretary. He served as Federal Reserve Chairman for 19 impressive years. During his 19-year tenure, he significantly influenced the Federal Reserve's policy logic and Treasury Department power dynamics, leveraging legal protections from prior agreements. Martin's stance is much tougher than previous Federal Reserve chairmen, primarily focusing on price control. From 1952 to 1965, the U.S. averaged 1.3% inflation, called the Martin Miracle. In 1965, amid the Vietnam quagmire and tight finances, President Johnson pressured Martin to ease monetary policy, but Martin refused. "I still want to raise rates by 0.5%. Doesn't that make you angry?" At that time, President Johnson was furious, saying, "Our children are dying in Vietnam, yet you refuse to print money." To me, Martin was the absolute hawk on monetary policy. With U.S. inflation below 2%, Martin believed low unemployment risked economic overheating, so he stubbornly raised the interest rate to 4.5%. However, Martin wasn't entirely inflexible or ignoring government demands. His style was tough in principle, but occasionally backed down. In 1953, Eisenhower, and in the 1960s, Kennedy pressured him. He conceded and cooperated with Treasury policy. Overall, Martin did establish a very good independent Federal Reserve, but its independence doesn't entirely come from power or legal protections. Much results from his balancing techniques. He formed the 4-person committee, including the Fed chairman, Treasury secretary, White House budget director, and economic advisors chairman. These 4 often dine and communicate thoroughly, helping the Federal Reserve maintain its relationship with the White House. Thus, Powell's tradition of dining with Bassett continues. I also consider the Martin era to be a deliberate campaign, during which the Federal Reserve's independence rating consistently rose to 7. Are you curious when it increased? This score is my subjective assignment and holds no authority. If you think it's wrong, that's your responsibility. Have you noticed the main difference between the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government is that the Fed usually supports raising rates and tightening? The U.S. government, as economist Heitz has commented, often presents the Fed chairman with a president and Congress that are hostile towards rate hikes. Why harbor hostility? As a government, they oppose rate hikes for two reasons. Rate hikes can suppress the economy, a key measure of presidential performance. His term's economic performance. Historically, U.S. presidents exert the most pressure on the Federal Reserve the year before an election, especially before consecutive elections. And another reason. When government debt interest rates rise, borrowing costs increase, so if war funds are needed, the Treasury pressures the Federal Reserve for resources. Economic growth and debt costs are the U.S. government's fundamental interests, so the president and government may feel helpless, especially when facing a very hawkish Federal Reserve chair. They tightly control prices, but the economy might suffer during their tenure. The Federal Reserve chair can be reappointed, lasting longer than themselves. Ultimately, people still blame the president. So when the Fed raises rates, the president reflexively opposes and is very happy when they cut them. During Trump's first term, the Fed raised rates 4 times in 2018. Trump candidly vented his frustrations at Powell and the Federal Reserve. Since the pandemic, Powell quickly cut rates to zero and began quantitative easing. Trump uncharacteristically praised him warmly. Let's see how the Martin era stays Martin. Don't worry, he's soon removed, Li Zongsheng. By 1969, U.S. inflation was rising rapidly, so Martin aggressively increased rates by 1%. The newly inaugurated President Nixon immediately became angry as he had previously. Last year, he pledged to revitalize the U.S. economy, but after taking office, he denounced stubborn Martin, accusing him of pushing it into recession. As for Martin, he had been Fed chair for nearly 20 years, standing firm and completely ignoring Nixon's pressure. Nixon wanted to quickly replace Martin, but what was the problem? This U.S. president couldn't legally dismiss the Federal Reserve chairman arbitrarily. Instead, Nixon employed a cunning move as Martin's term concluded in 1970 the following year. Although Nixon couldn't directly remove him from office, he announced in advance that the new Federal Reserve chairman would be Burns, who was his own ally. In this way, all the attention and focus in the market shifted to successor Burns, effectively sidelining Martin and forcing him to step down early. Isn't this similar to Powell's situation, whose term ends next year while Trump continues attacking him? Many people speculate Trump may use Nixon's same tactic by announcing the appointment early, to sideline him. After the newly appointed Burns was installed by Nixon, his policy style can be summarized in 4 words: comply without question. He immediately cut interest rates and again in 1972 to support Nixon's re-election, often driven by anxiety. He proactively cut rates. How do I know? Because later a famous event happened. This White House recording happened to expose some conversations between Nixon and Burns. For example, on December 10, 1971, Burns called Nixon and said, "Mr. President, I have reduced the discount rate to 4.5%. Nixon was very pleased, repeatedly saying, "Good, good, good. I told Burns I've done all I can." When you became president and built your reputation and see this cooperative attitude, no need to speak. I've already got it covered. I was being sarcastic. Although Burns may seem sycophantic, he's a distinguished economist who successfully engaged with Nixon. However, the strength was insufficient. During Burns' tenure, the Fed effectively ceded its independence, giving it a 3 out of 5 rating. However, every cloud has a silver lining. During Dole's era, benefits emerged as Congress scrutinized the Fed's policies more strictly due to the ineffective chairman. The Fed cannot act recklessly under presidential directives and must fulfill its price stability and employment mandate by reporting to Congress biannually. They must attend hearings before both houses. I sympathize with the Fed chairman. Despite his title, sitting in Congress for 2 hours feels like being a prisoner, repeatedly grilled. Why are you raising interest rates? Why is inflation so high? Why are you printing money? Why this, why that? 100,000 whys. And it's the same twice a year. When I first saw it, I was by this intensity. If I was sitting there, I would have to cry. Anyway, after Burns's tenure, Congress significantly strengthened its institutional oversight of the Fed. And immediately following was the Fed's highlight moment, which was its next chairman, Paul Volcker. Look at this highlight moment. First of all, he's exceptionally tall, over 2 meters. Usually when you see him, you have to bow your head. Heh. In 1979, Paul Volcker became head and faced the U.S. economy's worst period in nearly a century. 14% inflation, 7.5% unemployment, and gold prices caused U.S. stagflation. Upon taking office, Volcker's strict goal was to stabilize prices and reduce inflation by raising the federal funds rate from 11% to over 20%. Inflation was suppressed, dropping from 13.5% in 1980 to 3%. People called Volcker's achievements a miracle, and I do too. Let me tell you, don't think that his rate hikes back then were as simple as a few words. He was under immense pressure. Raising interest rates to 20% led the US into its worst recession since World War II. In 1982, unemployment hit 10.8%, bankrupting many small businesses and farmers. He received death threats, and Carter privately criticized Reagan's ineffective interference. Volcker declared, "It must be done my way," declining White House invitations and affirming the Federal Reserve's independence, marking the most intense period yet between the Fed and the US government. But time proved that Volcker's choices were right, and not just right in general, but very right indeed. After a brief pain, the US economy retained over 20 years of vitality. Having left Bretton Woods, Walker strongly maintained dollar inflation. These policies boosted confidence in the dollar, establishing its global reserve status for half a century. This status has persisted since Walker, despite the Fed's dual mandate. When conflicting monetary policy prevails. During Walker's period, Federal Reserve independence was rated 9 of 10. Greenspan succeeded Walker as Federal Reserve chairman, serving 18 and a half years and becoming the second longest chairman. His popularity is ambiguous. Greenspan was a master of language, pushing its art to extremes. His ambiguous statements allowed his words to be interpreted in any way. For example, he often said, "If you think you understand me, you have misinterpreted my meaning." His exact meaning remains unsaid. He often used metaphors like describing the market's irrational exuberance as either exuberance or overheating. In hearings, his evasive, non-committal answers ensured he was always right. It seemed he mastered some Eastern linguistic arts. Greenspan did an excellent job balancing the market and Treasury needs, leading Fed to stress thorough communication. A veteran spanning 4 presidencies, he remarkably synchronized market expectations. Throughout a Federal Reserve chair's term, U.S. presidents never dared to criticize their independence ratings. Greenspan was prestigious and preserved the Fed's independence. However, he was lenient and made mistakes. Therefore, it was a key reason for the 2008 subprime crisis. Have you noticed the pattern in Federal Reserve Chair's work? Its role extends beyond inflation control, caught between market and U.S. government. The government can influence the Federal Reserve, while the Fed can't solely support the market. Otherwise, the White House will find ways to control it. If it favors the government, it's serious. The market may attack the dollar, undermining the Fed and U.S. government. Therefore, the Fed, it actually has to seek a very delicate balance in between, maintain independence and win market trust without angering the government or president, as Martin and Greenspan served successfully for long periods. It's not only that they were tough, they meticulously balanced and thoughtfully gauged the right measures. Look at Martin, as said earlier. Martin was principled, tough, sometimes patient. Greenspan was Hossein. Both maintained independence intact during transitions. Although the president can appoint a new one, it always seems that this chairman is somewhat stubborn. However, he can cooperate when needed. The market still trusts him, otherwise it would have failed. Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen became chairman after crisis. On the surface, the government did not interfere with decisions, but their independence was by Federal Reserve policies during this period, were completely aligned with the government's needs. For a decade, Fed acted consistently, implemented QE, printing money, bond purchases to meet demands. The synchronized demands from both sides made the Federal Reserve easy to manage, so presidents rarely raised objections during this period. Tension arose only during congressional hearings. In the post-financial crisis era, I rate the Federal Reserve's independence 7 out of 10. The Federal Reserve and Treasury have clashed for years, primarily on cutting interest rates and policies. After the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve increased its regulatory power, overseeing banks. The Federal Reserve always had regulatory power, though less prominent until the significant Dodd-Frank Act was passed after 2008 and 2018. The Federal Reserve now strictly enforces enhanced regulations for large financial institutions, causing stress among Wall Street investment bankers. Risk indicators and capital ratios are extremely strict. They may be somewhat overreaching, but surpassing them is difficult. After strict regulations, some smaller banks like SVB failed. Before 2020, resistance to regulatory power independence was minimal as the Federal Reserve engaged in large-scale, unprecedented quantitative easing. Everyone was making money, so no complaints. But rising interest rates and tightening measures have changed things, despite Trump's constant calls for Federal Reserve rate cuts. Benson's interviews show their institutional target is not the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, but its regulatory authority. Finally, we've entered the post-pandemic trade war or Trump era, with the Federal Reserve criticized for executing monetary policy more independently. Under pressure, it compromises by collaborating with Treasury and the President. Subtitles Yang Qiangqi. By gradually loosening financial regulations, it satisfied Republican demands. During pandemic, it partnered with Treasury to loan local governments and SMEs. You cannot claim the Federal Reserve has backed down as necessary, yet overall policies remain relatively loose and independent. It considers the White House and Treasury, giving an independence rating of 8 out of 10. Over the past century, don't you feel that although the Federal Reserve Act ensures the Fed's nominal independence, it still relies on specific individuals and political maneuvering? Let's see how Trump plans to maneuver with the White House and Treasury Department, manage the Federal Reserve, and apply pressure. The first move is personnel. Can Trump actually dismiss Powell? The simple answer is no, unless Trump can provide sufficient legitimate reasons. Proving Powell violated laws, neglected duty, was morally corrupt or mentally unstable may require labor arbitration for Trump to dismiss him, though it's unlikely now. The U.S. President nominates the Federal Reserve Chair, and the Senate confirms the appointment. Chairs serve 4-year terms and may be reappointed. If Trump is merely dissatisfied with the Federal Reserve's policies, he cannot dismiss Powell until the 4-year term ends. Powell was appointed in 2018 during Trump's first term. During Biden's term, he was reappointed, thus his term expires in 2026. Trump can announce next chair early, like Nixon. Using a shadow chair to sideline Powell hasn't happened yet. However, if Trump truly wants to influence the Federal Reserve, he must act. Not necessarily only targeting Powell, because the Federal Reserve has a very important characteristic. It is not a single person. In fact, all major decisions at the Federal Reserve are made jointly by the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, which consists of 12 members. Each person has the same voting weight, so theoretically, this chairman does not have a greater vote. It does not mean chairman decides everything. So for Trump, assuming he can control the majority of these 12 people, he can control and influence the Federal Reserve's decisions. Mechanistically, among these 12 members, 7 are appointed by the government. 5 regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents make decisions together. For rotation and selection details, watch our Federal Reserve video. Its role is to balance relationships between government, banks, and the market. Even the 7 government appointees are hard to replace. Each person has a 14-year term with expirations every 2 years. For example, Powell's ends in 2026 and Lee Sheeran's in 2028, so even if he steps down next year. He is likely to remain on the 12-person team with voting rights. The government has always tried to influence the Federal Reserve, not only by appointing the chairman, but also by attracting more dovish individuals to the FOMC, referring to those who support the easing of monetary policy. When determining which of the 12 are hawkish or dovish, inclinations are clear. 7 government appointees are dovish, while the rest are hawks. Most originate from the Reserve Bank, where ongoing hiring and appointments indirectly affect Federal Reserve decisions. However, it's currently impossible for him to replace all 7 people at once, making immediate results difficult. Another way Trump might interfere with the Federal Reserve is through executive orders. Although changing legislation is difficult, the president can temporarily restrict the Federal Reserve through executive orders. For example, in February this year, Trump issued one. It requires all independent agencies to submit to and communicate regularly with the White House. This aligns with our earlier point. Trump and Bessenwant aim to limit the Federal Reserve's regulatory authority and ease its oversight. Aside from 2 tactics, Trump mainly influences the Federal Reserve through public opinion, stating, "Europe has cut interest rates, why haven't you?" If this continues, it's over. "Powell, you're always too slow, always wrong." He pressures Fed via public opinion. However, this tactic has not been effective so far and might have backfired. Though Trump is the U.S. president with almost unparalleled power, he remains largely powerless against certain institutions, particularly the Federal Reserve. He can directly impose various tough policies on departments, organizations, and countries. He curses more harshly than anyone else, but never resorts to physical attacks. Recently, he threatened to fire Powell, but retracted within a week. For example, the executive order requires alignment with, although intended to weaken the Federal Reserve's power, he focused solely on regulation since the executive order excluded the Fed's monetary policy. Monetary policy doesn't require White House review. He had no need to add this clause, indirectly confirming the White House remains unchanged. Although he wants to, he hesitates to interfere with Federal Reserve policies, proceeding with extreme caution because the Fed is more than just an independent agency. With backing behind it, what serves as a U.S. government is the trust of the market. From 1951 to now, leaders like Martin, Walker, Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and Powell built sustainable market trust. Because of this trust, the dollar serves as a reserve currency, allowing global capital and central banks to invest in it easily. It far exceeds the market's trust in the U.S. government. Tariffs seem significant, linking many countries. However, we found actual imports are only $3 trillion, widely varied and not tightly connected. As for financial markets, you could say it's deeply connected to the marrow of the U.S. Whether government bonds, major corporate bonds, or stocks, they all rely on global trust in the U.S. financial market. The trust in the U.S. dollar and the anchor behind it is the Federal Reserve. Trump pushing rate cuts is one thing, but if he weakens dollar's foundation, it would be disastrous. Basant has warned the White House that dismissing Powell could cause market turmoil. Trump's recent actions have shaken much of the market's trust in the dollar, prompting large countries to undergo some de-dollarization. Though the market generally believes that Trump doesn't dare to move the Federal Reserve, weakening its independence, there are still concerns that if one day he is in a bad mood and rolls out a policy, what if this really happens? That would be a real black swan event for the market. Mr. President, I want you to know that I have lowered the interest rate to help you become president. Why so mean? Welcome the Federal Reserve's highlight moment, Paul Walker fainted. Historically known as the Walker miracle, I added it myself.